Buenos días, Egunon.
Good morning, everybody. Firstly, thank you so much for inviting me to take part today at this conference. Congratulations to the organizers. It's an honor, but also a pleasure to share with all of you this half an hour, as I've been told by the presenter, to talk to you. I'm going to start in the following way. I don't usually use PowerPoints, and I haven't been doing so because many years ago at an event similar to this one that was organized in Santiago, and it was my turn to speak. I had to go through a corridor, and the rector of the university that were organizing it came to me and said to me, "Hey, Anton, have you got a PowerPoint projector? Or are you going to tell us something?" And that really has affected me. So from that moment onwards, I've always said, okay, when you're invited to a place to speak, try to have clear in your mind what it is that you want to say. So if it's okay with you, I'm going to start by explaining to you what I want to talk about. And during the rest of the time, I'll try to argue my topic. My wife always says to me, just take a small PowerPoint with you, because otherwise they think you haven't prepared anything. So I always try to do both things. Let's see what happens. Firstly, what I want to say. I believe that as a society, and societies, Western societies special, their main challenge for Western societies is to reverse the incredible inequality and lack of shared prosperity that has happened over the last 40 years. That is, since the end of 1970s. To do that, to reverse this very strong trend, which reminds me of what happened before the First and before the Second World Wars, to reverse these inequalities and loss of prosperity. We need to remember that the main reason for this is employment and the loss of good jobs that has happened, and I especially highlight over the last 40 years. So if we share that as a priority, and I think we probably do, then for me, the goal is to see how we can create good jobs for more people. And especially, I'm going to insist on this in more places around Spain. I'm going to focus much on the idea of employment or jobs and territories, because I think that many of the social and political ills that our societies are suffering from are related to a lack of prosperity over recent decades in certain territories, in certain areas and communities. In addition to creating good jobs for more people and in more places around our country, I'd also even add that quite probably we're going to need to build within this social contract, we're going to need to be able to build a guarantee for public employment, because the market economy has never been able and never will be able off its own bat to create sufficient job opportunities to offer work to all of those people who want to work. And we need to remember that, especially in the times that are just coming, because that means that we need to include some kind of public guarantee for employment. That means that everybody that wants to work can have some kind of work under minimum dignified working conditions. So this is the first thing I wanted to say. Secondly, we're just wondering, okay, that's great, that's the goal, that's the ultimate goal, but why where do good jobs come from? Because it's really important. It's no good just to say rhetorically, oh, we need to create good jobs. I feel there's a clear response to this. Good jobs come from good companies. That's private companies and, of course, public companies, and especially here public administrations. I think this is something that we need to remember the moment that we are creating good job policies. We need to know that that is closely tied to the existence of good companies. So in this new social contract, we need to ask ourselves, how can companies actually create good jobs in more places around our country? Thirdly, let me see if I can get this message across to you. It's insufficient, I feel, as you're going to be doing today and tomorrow, it's insufficient to pinpoint good policies and then apply and implement them. I think that's insufficient. In fact, the challenges that are ahead of us are so great now. That's digitization, decarbonization, and the consequences that the pandemic is going to have on digitization itself. The tremendous size and number of challenges that are ahead of us requires that in the heart of our societies, we need to create a commitment between those that are for whom things are going well and those who are going to just be left behind, run the risk of being left behind. The Vice President used something that I actually really liked, but you don't actually hear amongst public powers. This appearance, once again, of child poverty. I'm not talking about the working poor, but child poverty. And it's really surprising how very little we consider how much child poverty is increasing in Spain and has done over recent years. The most recent statistics that were published just 3 weeks ago shows that Spain has the highest level of child poverty in the European Union, except for Hungary and Bulgaria. I think this is really important when we consider, and that requires a commitment. Why do I say that? Because if you can accept this, it's not sufficient, even though it is very important, it's not just sufficient to design good employment policies, just implementing those employment policies or improving the ones that we are developing, which is what you'll be doing here to a large extent. The idea is to create a framework, create a political and moral framework to reflect this new social contract, this new commitment. Perhaps with something which maybe isn't the best example, but for me, good policies are like seeds that a farmer throws onto the ground. However, if this land hasn't been prepared, hasn't been ploughed, then these seeds will not flourish or will not give the fruits that you expect from them. For me, a social contract is the part which involves preparing the social and political land, ploughing that social and political field, so that many social policies that may otherwise come up against resistance or reluctance or just partial results, but if they're on a properly fertilized ground, will flourish in that they will provide fruit and last over time, because otherwise good policies or policies that are necessary in our country, if they don't have this prepared land, if they don't have favourable currents of opinion, it may well be that the next government, whichever government it is, may just change these policies, and this is continually zigzagging, this coming and going of policies. The only way of avoiding it is by creating a new climate, a new social contract that allows different opinions in society to concentrate on these and prevents governments who attempted to reverse them come up against resistance among society to do so. My wife's a doctor, she's a neurologist, and she convinced me that humans actually can't do two things properly at the same time. Either you listen to me or you read what's on the screen, and what I want you to do is to listen to me. That's why I didn't put that up earlier. Fourthly, normally when you say this, somebody says in a quiet little voice, well, that's the truth if you're talking about men, but not if you're talking about women. But anyway. Fourthly, the question is, will we have energy and sufficient strength to build this new social contract? The idea that I think, anyway, is that fortunately, COVID has created what some politologists or political experts call a window of opportunity, or John Rawls, the philosopher of justice, called in his book, creates a veil of ignorance regarding the future, which makes us more rational, makes all of us more rational in the sense that we agree that a new social contract needs to be built. Allow me, for the rest of my time, to try to go into more depth and talk more about these four claims. And I'm going to do so via two questions which I've been interested in for many years now, and as the presenter said, have been what has stimulated one of my recent books. By the way, that one that was mentioned lastly wasn't published last month, but is being published this week. The questions that I'm interested in over the last couple of years is the following. Can we find a common response to this question? What are the causes for this social resentment that exists in the majority of our societies, of this excess of political polarization, because political polarization goes hand in hand with the party political democracy. But what we're talking about is the excess of polarization. You know that in the bibliography of the last 10 years, there are two explanations for this. One is a cultural, and the other is a socioeconomic. The cultural explanation says that there's a social unease, and populism is due to a large extent to cultural issues. And what I mean by that are generational confrontations. Pippa Norris has explained this quite brilliantly, or the idea as identity as a cultural element, which may be leading to this phenomena of unease and populism. But I think that although there's a certain amount of validity behind the socio-cultural explanations, I think the most valid one comes from the socio-economic side of things, that behind this anger, this social resentment that you see in many segments of our societies, behind this resentment, behind this anger, is to a large extent the loss of prosperity that many local communities, small and medium-sized cities and regions have lost over the last 40 years as a result of industrial reconversion and delocalization. This has actually, I think, been very, very well documented in the UK, in the US, and in Europe. It's this lack of prosperity that many communities have lost at a local and territorial level, and this is what's generated to this resentment and this growing support from 2008 onwards for populist, extreme right or extreme left-wing parties, which existed in the past but which did didn't have a clear electoral backing at the time. Speeding up now, even though the cultural and the socioeconomic explanations are valid, I feel that the cultural explanation is like the second derivative. If there hadn't been this a loss of prosperity arising from a loss of quality employment and a loss of real purchasing power over salaries over the last 40 years, I think that the cultural tensions wouldn't have shown reared their ugly head in this way. But whatever happens, I also tend to for the socioeconomic explanation for a pragmatic reason, because if the cultural explanation is the correct one for these phenomena, its solution is by no means easy. However, if we accept with some figures that explanation is a socioeconomic one, then yes, we are able to offer policies that can have an impact on a return to prosperity. So, for me, what's really important here is that the major cause is the loss of prosperity. That's the way I see it. And this increasing inequality and lack of prosperity that is arising from bad jobs, what are we going to do about it? And what's going to happen from now onwards? Well, I think in addition to resentment, we're also coming up against another very worrisome motivation, which is the fear of the future. This fear that the future is very uncertain and we don't really know what will be like in this future. Even those of us that still have a job, that still have reasonable working conditions, are still very fearful of using that, either as a result of digitization, as a result of decarbonization, or as a result of the current pandemic and any pandemics that may come in the future. And I think we need to look a little closely at that fear and the lack of expectations for the future, because I think these are very worrying factors. So digitization, on many occasions, when I hear my economist colleagues and technological experts talking, we hear them use a reasoning which is interesting but also very dangerous. We take for granted that if there's a good if something is good in its basis, that it will end up producing good results. So that if we think that automation, digitization is inevitable, but is also good, then we reason that that'll be good for everybody in the end. It'll bring prosperity for everybody. But the question now, even if you accept that, what happens in the meantime? What about the transition to that? And actually, neither politicians, nor economists, nor technological experts tell us how to face this transition. And in the world of digitization, this is something that's actually really important. We've got clear data that show that automation during the era of industrialization in the middle of the last century destroyed jobs, but created more jobs. And in fact, the net result was the creation of more jobs, the result of plus or minus. But the figures between the 1980s and today regarding the impact of the digitization process seem to indicate that it may well be that we've got an excess of automation and digitization for society, because data, not so much for Spain, but data for other developed economy, what they're saying to us is that the destruction and replacement of jobs by new technologies and the creation, once again in this case, doesn't have a net effect. It's actually generating a net loss.
En segundo lugar, voy muy rápido.
Secondly, I'm a little worried about decarbonisation. And the reason here, once again, is somewhat naive, because quite obviously we're going to have to face up to the environmental transition. It's imperative, and for our civilization, we simply cannot conceive a civilization such as the current one in a situation of climate change. But how are we going to go through this transition between the current stage, the stage we're at now, and the desirable stage? Because what may happen is the same thing that happened with the industrial reconversions from the 1970s and deindustrialization from the 1970s and 80s. There, the reasoning used by the economists was the same. It's good. Decarbonization is good, and it'll end up being good for everybody. It'll end up bringing prosperity for all. I think societies have taken on board this message, but after 30 or 40 years, we've seen that actually there's been growth, as has been mentioned previously. There's been an increase in productivity, but there hasn't been prosperity for all territories, for all communities, and for everybody. No. In fact, many territories, and let's think, for example, in the deindustrialization of Asturias, in Catalonia, or in Galicia, and to an extent, the Basque Country, these kinds of processes, even though in general terms, in the medium and in the long term, have positive effects on the whole of the economy, the real problem, is that they leave many communities and many territories in a situation in which they lose both prosperity and expectations. And that's perhaps even more important. So the idea that I'm trying to get across to you today is that we need to keep a watchful eye on transitions. Policies need to keep an watchful eye on transition. A few days in Bilbao, I was talking to this about Miquel Roca, who's a well-known legal expert. He said to me, listen, Anton, my experience in the legal field is what's important about a law isn't so much how it's constructed, how it's more articulated. No, it's the transitory dispositions, the transition. Look at the transitory dispositions.
And if we look at the problem of transition from one state that is not so good to one that is what we wish to achieve, and us as politicians and technicians don't always bear this in mind, and what we have before us is a situation of very high uncertainty, even fear, if you want to see it like that, fear on behalf of many citizens, and probably fear of many of us here. And here I would like to differentiate some terms. For example, in economy, we differentiate something in economy, and that is risk and uncertainty, that in normal life we don't differentiate because they're not the same and they don't give place to the same policies. A risk is an event that we can perfectly predict. I can go to the street outside and I can have an accident, so you should have an insurance for that. So risk is a predictable situation for which there is historical data that allows us to estimate the probability of it happening and also estimate an insurance policy. So risk doesn't stop us in life. It doesn't stop the economy. It just makes us, if possible, to purchase an insurance for that risk, a private solution. So risks in politics, most of them, not all of them, are usually something that we can cover in a private way. What happens with uncertainty? Uncertainty is a different kind of situation. That's when we are not able to foresee what we have before us. The risk, as I said before, is a problem event. Here, we don't know. Uncertainty is like traveling now from Vitoria to Bilbao. In the motorway, we're speeding, but respecting the regulation, and suddenly there's a lot of fog. What do you do then? Do you continue driving, or do you stop on the side of the road and wait for the fog to disappear. The fog doesn't allow us to see what the situation will be in the future. It doesn't allow us to see if there is a truck, if there is something else on the road. It doesn't allow us to know about our immediate future, and that breaks us, that stops us. And we cannot cover this privately. The only situation is, the only option is to stop. So with a social contract, we need to take into account the community risks that have to do with the uncertainty. So we should design social insurances to confront the uncertainty. So I'm talking about two different situations. So the idea is, and I will finish here, is that the cause of social resentment and the excess of polarization and populism suffered by our democracies, first of all, has its cause in inequality, the tremendous inequality in our societies, and secondly, due to the loss of good jobs that has taken place in the last years. This is an important thesis. I'm not saying that inequality nowadays is because the welfare state doesn't work adequately. Understand me correctly. What I'm saying is today, great part of inequality in Spain, and 80% comes from bad jobs or the lack of a job. If that is so, then the problem is not redistribution. The problem is in production, in the business field, and in the pre-production area. And there are many policies. I had a table with policies, like a menu that you can choose from. But allow me, having gotten here, going to my first statement. Our challenge nowadays is not only designing good employment policies. Our challenge is like that of seeds. We need to prepare the soil, the political soil, so that these seeds and good policies germinate and remain through time. If not, we will have zigzag phenomena. Let me give you an example. Those of us here and those listening to us online probably share the fact that the minimum income is a progressive policy, a way of confronting the problem of poverty, not of unemployment. It's a good policy, and probably compared experience shows that institutions need a decade for this to be fully established and for it to be fruitful. What is the risk, and why do I mention this? Because in the work of Victor Pérez Díaz, sociologist, in a survey to the Spaniards, more than 70% says that this minimum income is adequate for now, but they don't defend it as a permanent policy. So we could think that if this doesn't change socially, a policy such as this one that is necessary to continue could maybe be reverted. So what am I speaking about when I speak about a new social contract? And up to what point is it possible to build it? And even though they gave me a long half an hour, I have to go through this very quickly. The second question for me is the following. What makes a pluralist society like ours with a market economy to operate harmoniously? Harmoniously meaning not that there's no social conflict or labor conflict, because conflict is a part of the society model, but the issue is how are we able to, and as the great thinker Albert Hitchman said, how can we deal with conflict in such a way that conflict does not transform into this or that, which is unsolvable. This brings us to social fight or business fight. No, we should deal with the conflict in such a way in which the conflict typology is or a bit more or a bit less. That's a way of dealing with it adequately by negotiating. So what's the answer? Why a pluralist society with market economy works harmoniously and deals with these conflicts? My answer is that social contract. But what is the social contract, and why do we have to speak about it again? Very quickly again, and I apologize. For me, the social contract is like invisible glue. If it exists in society, then we see that there's a harmony. And I see that democracy works more or less in an adequate manner. But when I see that we are overcome by conflict and that we are overcome democracy, then I see, well, this glue is dry and is broken. And what is this glue? A second definition could be it's a commitment, a moral and political commitment between those whose lives are going well and those that are risking being left behind. But not a rhetorical commitment, a commitment that when you accept it brings you to pay taxes so that you can fund the policies necessary to structure that commitment. There's another way of seeing the social contract too. A social contract establishes rules to see how we live in a market economy or a capitalist economy, even though it's not exactly the same thing. So it has different stages. It is bipolar, and it will continue to be so. So when we reach the depression stages, there will be significant costs. The question is how we share this cost. In 2008, the data for Spain tells us that 80% of the invoice goes to workers and their families. Now we know, and this is what institutions like the Bank of Spain say, that approximately 20% of the cost of the pandemic crisis has been paid by families and workers, and the rest of the 80% is paid by businesses. So this is very different to the way in which we face the crisis. And at the same time, the social contract needs to have rules regarding how we share the prosperity provided by expansion stages. That's fundamental. Post-war social contract in the 50s, 60s, and 70s had good rules for the share of benefits during growth. And many of us that are older come from that. We come from that social contract. Everything improved. But after the 80s, there has been growth, there has been prosperity, there has been productivity, but it hasn't been shared in the adequate manner. Therefore, the social contract needs to incorporate new rules, and I insist it is incorporating it regarding the share of costs of the crisis, but it also needs to include new rules regarding how we share prosperity. And once again, we go back to the issue of employment. And I've finished with this. Maybe due to chance or providence or the stars, this weekend I was reading a book of essays by Stefan Zweig, and I suddenly read one of the chapters of the book that starts like this. And let me read to you, because I was really surprised by this. Each time the world transforms, and obviously we're in transformation, each time the world transforms, we go back, Zweig says, to Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Every time the pillars for social order change and contradictions arise, every time the main ideas of the state are questioned, and every time the traditions fall, we can always count on him as a prophet or counselor, because his work is outside of time and his person represents, like no other, the defense of the rights of men. Rousseau, as you know, has one big work, which is the social contract. So every time the world transforms, we need to go back to Rousseau and to the social contract and to the political philosophers that beyond Rousseau, after the Enlightenment, have told us that this is a good way of organizing society, politics, building the moral fabric of citizens in present democracies. We need, I believe, to go back to the idea of social contract that at the end of the day means rebuilding a moral and political commitment between those who are doing well and those who might be left behind. And finally, and I will really finish with this, do we have the sorry, I had a graph because my wife said you should take a graph so that they can see that you've prepared this presentation. And the question could be, why is a social contract going to bring healthier and sustainable growth that is inclusive? Well, a way of saying it is the following. Economists, and I don't know if I have time left. Yes? Okay. When economists are asked what are the elements that determine the growth of our community or a country, we start by looking at the literature, and we look at what you see here vertically. To have more growth, you need more productive capital, which is reasonable. For more growth, you need more infrastructures. It's also reasonable. To have more growth, you need more R&D, which is also reasonable, and flexibility. We usually highlight a labor flexibility more than that of our markets of goods and services, a bias that hasn't been fully corrected. But what could happen, and you have the age and experience to reflect on this, a country, a business can have good production elements but not be operational or productive. A well-known businessman recently said to me, and he said, "Anton, it is very difficult to manage a business with staff that is unhappy. You can have all the elements, but if there's no cooperation and nothing that allows to improve the total productivity of elements, that is how you combine everything to produce in the best way possible, if you're not able to achieve this, then probably the type of growth that you will have will not be the one you want to achieve, which is the 1.4, but one of these other three." And in this sense, and I wouldn't want to stop here, I would like to call your attention to the importance of a social contract and the rate of literacy. The Vice President didn't mention this before, but recently she said that approximately 47% of Spaniards are digitally illiterate. So to confront these big transformations with high rates of illiteracy is going to be very difficult. And do we have the strength to build this social contract? Do we have the energy to do so? Well, in my view, there are three things that help you do so, but the energy has to come from society. First of all, the pandemic has opened a window of opportunities that we didn't expect. We should have faced the digitization, but because of these opportunities, we are now able to use elements of the old social contract that had been destroyed in the last years. That's the new tax policies that were put in place in March 2020, as well as all the benefits that provide an income. This was part of the old social contract, as well as all the regeneration from Europe. These are all elements that recover the old idea of the social contract. So there is a window of opportunities. Making the most of it or not will depend on us. Secondly, there are new ideas, new economic ideas, and new political ideas to create a more productive and efficient economy that is fairer. Up till now, and I usually explain this in this way, when I was explained the economy, they explained to me as a student that there was a dilemma between social justice and efficiency. And it says you have the right to defend a fair society, but you must be aware that it has a cost, because the relationship between social justice and economic efficiency is negative. If you want to increase social justice, then you will have to reduce efficiency, which was a terrible dilemma. For 7 years now, there's a new epiphany, a new revelation in the economy that is not very well known yet, that allows us to say that fighting for greater social justice is investing in the economy. Fighting today to have universal education from 0 to 3 is not an expense, it's an investment in the economy and investing in the mothers of those children. I studied and I explained. There's a red line in my classes, which was terrible, and you had to end by saying, well, in any case, it's worthwhile fighting for a fair justice, even though the economy is a bit less efficient. But nowadays we know, with the studies that we have, with that epiphany that doesn't come from the Vatican, but from institutions that sometimes are not very kind, like the monetary fund, we know that increasing social justice is not expanding but investing in economy itself. So these new ideas, as well as new policies, will allow us to have tools to build that new social, that new moral and political commitment. But the energy has to come from the social agents. So I leave this in your hands. Thank you, and I'm sorry I took too much time. Thanks.
Bueno, me han dicho que la acreditación en el plástico es donde tienen la tarjetita para formular las preguntas.
That's where you have the card for questions. Mr. Costas, I do have one question for you, even though we're a bit late. I've always been surprised that they invite you to talk and then they only give you 15 or 20 minutes. Well, but you've taken more time, didn't you? We have here some seats for the agents that will be talking about what you've defended, and that is the social contract that you talked about being as a glue, and how you sow the seeds for this commitment. So very briefly, for those that are going to join us here, for all of us, because we are all affected by this, how do we start with the social contract? What's the starting point with what they're doing, which is this meeting? Improving what we already have, the policies that already exist. I believe there's a big margin to improve. For what I've seen, there's many people with experience to improve this in the program. And today they should suggest new policies for better jobs for more people in more places in the country, which is my concern. Antón Costas, thank you for joining us.